As you can probably tell from some of my previous builds, I'm often inspired by video games I play, and I happen to have been playing a fair amount of Helldivers 2 recently. In particular, it really reminded me of Killteam, with its small squad completing various objectives, and even more so given the kill teams I most often play against are Necrons and Tyranids. Plus, Helldivers and 40k are kind of spiritual siblings, both taking inspiration from Starship Troopers, giving it a lot of potential for conversions. The idea I decided to go with was making a kill team of Helldivers I could use in-game. There are a few potential kits I could start off with. I know it should be something Imperial Guard based, given there are similarities between their main armour style and Helldivers, both being loosely based on the mobile infantry of Starship Troopers. While Cadians or Scions would work, Cassicans were the ones which most closely resembled Helldivers, plus they have a dedicated kill team box, which tend to come with a variety of options and even extra bits which are perfect for customising and converting. I just made sure to check a few things first, like making sure I could build them all with the full face helmet covering options, and that the armour had close enough spots for the yellow trim of the Helldivers black and yellow scheme. And it seemed to have exactly what I needed, so I picked up a box and got to work. I started simple with the first one, built with a fully covering helmet option, and some modifications to the gun to make it look close to the default weapon of the Helldivers, the Liberator. I couldn't bulk up the rifle to fully match the look, but I could at least remove the wires, which work since these guys won't have the backpacks. And I also cut the front of the gun short, then gave it a smaller muzzle by drilling in a hole in the front to glue in some paperclip wire. Still keeping it relatively simple for the second one, I made the same changes to the gun, as I would for most of these, but went with the grenade throwing arm options. It gives some variety with the poses, and it's also fitting for the Helldivers since it works as shutting down a bug hole or a bot factory, or even calling down a stratagem marker. From there, I looked at what other weapons I could give the units, and given I'm partial to using shotguns in the game, that felt like a good place to start. I used one from the Arbites kill team, and tried to find a Cassikin which had the arms in a similar enough place so I could just cut it at the weapon handle and swap it out for the rifle. The Cassikin kit itself already comes with a good variety of weapon options, but one of those that matches a game option is the flamethrower. So I built one with that loadout, the only change being cutting off the fuel tank from the backpack so I could attach it to the weapon itself to match the game's version a bit better. Then I started to look for some even heavier weapon options I could add, and the autocannon seemed like a good one. I searched my bits and found a spare autocannon from an Iron Strider Ballistarius. I just cut down the barrel a little to match the scale a bit better, and trimmed the back so it could rest on the unit's shoulder. Then I just used whatever Cassikin arms that were in the right enough position to hold it, along with a scope from one of the rifles I didn't use. A nice extra touch I decided to add to my squad was a guard dog rover. I made the body of it by gluing together two of the Cassikin backpacks I wouldn't be using, then attached some of the thrusters from a Space Marine backpack. Then for its energy weapon I used the plasma pistol option from the Cassikin Sergeant. Since the game isn't all just bot shooting and bug stomping, I wanted to include a trooper doing something related to the game's objectives. For this I made one to match the carrying of the SSD, using the pistol and mine holding arm options from the demo trooper, but I replaced the mine with the fancier backpack from the Vox trooper. Another thing from the game I thought would be neat to include is some of the pack options. So for the next trooper I built them mostly normally, but also made them a version of the supply pack, using some ammo boxes I had spare from a Scorpius Dune Rider, plus the Cassikin Medics pouch, since the game's resupplies also refills your stims. I wanted to use the Cassikin Demo Trooper for some armour type variety, and a heavy weapon seemed like it would be a good fit with the heavy armour, so I looked for a rocket launcher since the game has a few of those. I bought some bits from a Space Marine Devastator, since one of those units has both a launcher and a loader backpack. Normally I'd be hesitant to use Space Marine parts for more regular soldiers given their size difference, but it came from a kit of old Firstborn Space Marines, meaning it wouldn't be too far out of scale. So starting with those bits, I just cut off and trimmed the Space Marine arm holding the weapon, and replaced it with one of the sword holding Cassikin arms, since it had a handle and the right kind of pose, only needing a little adjustment at the wrist. And I adjusted another spare Cassikin arm to use and just trimmed down the sides of the backpack, so I was left with just the rocket loader parts. The squad needed a leader, so I went with a pose to try and signify that, using one of the pointing arms and a rifle just held at the side. And for another touch to really make him stand out, I wanted to replicate the helmet wings from the Super Citizen's Saviour of the Free armour. I remembered a similar fancy helmet from another kill team I had the parts for, the Arbite Kit's leader, so I cut the wings from that helmet and attached it to the side of the Caskins. For the last trooper, I wanted to give them something to match the game's railgun weapon. I got a few different railgun type parts to test, but it was tricky matching the exact weapon details, with hands and arms holding it in the right way to attach to the body of the unit. In the end, I went with adding the front half of a Tau rifle to the back half of a Kaskin rifle I cut down, and along with the binocular helmet he works as this squad's sniper. Now all the squad was built, but there was one last step before they were proper Helldivers. Their capes. A good material for making fabric type parts is normally green stuff, and while I'm not good at sculpting it, I have found an easy method for making simple bits of it. And that is to look at sewing patterns, and to test that out on the model with paper before cutting out green stuff that had been rolled flat to match the paper pattern. So all the sculpting that needs to be done is just laying it on the model and then lightly pushing it into place. Here I did add an extra step or two though. After figuring out the pattern with paper, I made a stencil of it with plasticard, as I'd be using it a lot and I needed something slightly sturdier than paper. I made a few more capes than I needed just so I could pick the best ones to use, and once they were cut out I made a few unique alterations to each one, just cutting simple patterns on the bottom to match some of the different in-game cape options. I also tried to lightly score a few lines on either side of the cape and then slightly pinch them to give them folds, so they weren't completely flat. Then, all that was left to do was to place them on top of the model in the right place and push down on them at the shoulders with a silicone-tipped tool, just so that they were attached to the model, but there weren't any big marks where I pushed down and secured them. Then the last thing to assemble were the backpacks. I wasn't sure exactly which units I wanted to have which packs, so I magnetised a few, just drilling a hole for a 3x2mm magnet in the packs and in the back of the few troopers under the capes. With all that done, I could finally get to painting. I wanted to keep this squad simple and consistent, so I went with the black and yellow most of the Helldiver armour sets are in. Now painting black can be tricky, because the way you normally paint a colour is you start with the base colour, and you shade it with a wash so it looks like it's got shadows where the recesses are darker, then you highlight it so the raised edges are brighter to look like they're catching more light. But black is already a very dark colour, so it's hard to shade, and for a similar reason, white is hard to highlight, given it's already very bright. Fortunately, I've had some practice painting black armour with my Black Templars, and figured out a quick way to get some good depth using dry brushing and multiple shades of black and grey. As I often do, I start with a coat or two of black primer, here paying extra attention to the capes, as it can be tricky to get the inside of the cape and their green colour can be quite noticeable if a spot is missed. Then I do a heavy dry brush with the paint slightly brighter than the prime, Corvus Black, so the recesses remain dark but everywhere else is slightly brighter. It's a very broad and very slight highlight, inversely shading it I guess. From there it's a more traditional dry brush with a bit of Eshin grey paint, using downward strokes to just catch the more raised areas and edges. Then a very light dry brush with the lighter Dawnstone grey, just focused on the most raised edges around the upper parts of the model, like the head and the shoulders. While doing this, there's also the opportunity to brighten any bigger parts of the model with Dawnstone, because it can be tricky painting brighter colours over black, so you can brighten them a bit here to make it easier later, which is what I did with the Sniper's railgun since I plan to paint that a bright grey. Also, it may look a bit too bright for black armour at this point, but it won't be as extreme once there are other colours on the model, and even after that it can still be darkened easily with a black shade or a grey contrast where necessary. The next part of the scheme was the yellow on parts of the armour, which I used Avalan Sunset for. I tried to pick out parts similar to the yellow on the Helldiver's armour, so a line at the bottom of the jacket, a line around the shoulder pads, some small detail on the helmet, and a line at the top of the knee pads. If you can find a good way to add some vertical lines to the helmet, that would be ideal, but I'm not particularly good at freehand so I left that bit out myself. Since yellow is tricky to paint, even more so over a dark colour like black, I needed to take my time and do 3 thin coats before I could get a consistent colour, and just to add a bit of warmth to it, I shaded it with the contrast Eandon yellow. Then, the last main colour of the Helldiver's armour is a bright silver, for all kinds of details like the harnesses, buckles, insignias, various devices, and a lot of parts on the gun. For this, I tried out Surcoat Silver from the Tooth & Coats paint range, which worked out great. Once that was dried, I shaded it with a black wash, the dark tone from Army Painter. For the leader, since I wanted him to look like he was wearing the Saviour of the Free or the Hero of the Federation armour, I used the gold paint Retributor armour. In most of the places I used yellow and silver on the other models. Given the leader of a kill team usually has slightly better rules for their weapons, I thought a good way to represent that would be to paint their weapon as the Helldivers Liberator Penetrator variant. For this, I painted it with a few coats of grey cere, which I also did for the railgun, as that is a brighter colour in the game too. There are a lot of fancy patterns on the game's capes, but my freehand is not good enough to do them well, so I just painted a few over the edges of them yellow and used some decals. Fortunately, the decal sheet that comes with the caskin matches pretty well with the icons on the Helldivers armour, with a lot of regular and winged skulls. So I just used those on the capes and shoulders, applying them regularly with water at first, then going over them with a decal softener just to make sure they sit flush on the model. Then, just to make sure they were fully blended in, I painted over any noticeable edges and shaded the whole section of the armour they were on. Then there were just a few smaller parts left to paint. For weapon sights and helmet cameras, I decided to go with green, as in-game weapons use green laser sights, so I used the contrast paint Corendress green, over a grey cere base on the weapon sights, but just over the existing black on the helmet cameras, just to keep it dull and not distract too much from the eyes. For some other details, I used corn red and cabalite green for some parts of the chest device, and then athematic blue over grey cere for the plasma effect on the guard dog. The eyes of any humanoid model are always a big focal point, and to make sure these look the part, I went over the visors with a gloss finish of Ardcoat. Hand painting some highlights or light reflections is also sometimes an option, but this area is small and tricky enough to reach anyway, let alone for precise highlights, so I just settled with the gloss coat. Now, I mentioned before that I most often play Killteam against Necrons and Tyranids, so I thought it might be a fun idea to paint one of those as the basic automatons and Terminids, since I can easily get my hands on them. For the Necron, I cut off its chin, as the automatons lack the jaws in their head design, dry brushed some greys and a few spots of metal, and used Rakarth flesh for the bone-coloured face, and then used some Blood Angel's red contrast for a few spots of red. And for the Tyranid, I dry brushed on some greys and browns, and used Eandon yellow for a few small spots of colour. As for basing, there are many options to choose from given the variety of planets that can be fought on in-game, but one that always stood out to me was Malevelon Creek. I remember the first time I played Helldivers 2. I had just finished the tutorial and a few bug missions on easy. I saw an old friend on Steam was playing it and I joined his game. I didn't know much about the systems, but he was already 30-something levels higher than me, and I just dropped in mid-base assault on one of the hardest difficulties. Going from a simple, low number of bugs on a bright empty desert, to a flood of enemies I'd never seen before, bots and tanks, in a dark, dense jungle where multiple directions at a time would be filled with red lasers coming straight at me. That mission and planet really stuck with me, so it made an obvious choice for basing my kill team. So for this dark alien jungle style of base, I had already started with some Astrogranite technical paint for the dull ground texture, and to darken it, while also giving it a hint of colour, I mixed my black Army Painter's Darktone wash with my blue Tooth & Coats Tempest Blue wash to shade the base. Then, for the vegetation part, I checked my local hobby shop and had found two things from Gamer's Grass, burnt grass and alien rosettes, which fit the look. So I bent the rosettes into shape, assembled them, trimmed the grass tufts a little, and attached those to the bases. Then, all that was left was the highlighting. I never do a huge amount of this, as the initial dry brushing often covers a lot of it. I just did an extra bit of edge highlighting on particularly prominent parts that I thought needed to stand out more. On the black armour, I highlighted with Dawnstone on the most prominent edges, and Administratum Grey for the prominent edges on the most upper parts. On the yellow, I highlighted with the original Avalanche Sunset, and then I used Tooth & Coats' Mithril Blade on the silver and gold parts. And that completes my Helldivers kill team, incorporating the main colour scheme, a few armour details, and weapon choices from the game, but still close enough to the original Kassakin for me to use them on the tabletop. And speaking of that, I already won a game with them against some Tyranids, doing my part to help spread some managed democracy. For Super Terror, of course. Now I'm happy with just the Killteam myself, but there's definitely potential for more with this idea. With plenty of alternate armour types and colour schemes, plus maybe enough to turn it into a full Imperial Guard army, with Cadian heavy weapon squads as sentry turrets, a Valkyrie Pelican 1 dropship, and Patriot exosuits made from Sentinels. Thanks for watching, and consider liking and subscribing if you want to see more Warhammer conversions.